A single sharp sound echoed in the silent courtroom. It wasn't a gavel, not a cough, but the crisp, deliberate sound of a clap. One person, then two. Sabrina Croft. Her face a mask of triumphant glee, applauded as my world dissolved into a haze of pain and crimson. She was clapping at the blood seeping through my dress, a public condemnation she believed was her final victory. My husband Richard stood motionless, his expression as cold and hard as the marble floors. They thought this was the end of my story, the closing argument in my public humiliation. They were wrong. This wasn't the end. It was the fuse being lit on a bomb that would obliterate not just my life, but the entire Vance dynasty. The summons arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a courier whose crisp uniform seemed to mock the disarray of my life. It was tucked inside a cream-colored envelope, the vellum thick and heavy with the scent of money and malice. My name, Cassandra Vance, was written in an elegant looping script that I knew belonged to my husband's personal assistant. Inside the legalese was dense, but the message was brutally clear. Richard Vance was formally petitioning the court for a mandatory DNA paternity test for our unborn child. Our apartment, a sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park, suddenly felt like a cage. The floor-to-ceiling windows, once a source of wonder, now seemed to display my private shame to the entire city of New York. Every surface was polished, every object curated by an interior designer whose fee could have funded a small country. It was Richard's world. I was just another one of his beautiful, expensive acquisitions. We had met 5 years earlier at a charity gala. I was a junior event planner, flustered and overwhelmed. He was Richard Vance, scion of the Vance Holdings empire, a man whose smile could charm birds from trees and whose ambition could level mountains. He pursued me with a relentless, intoxicating focus. He bought me dresses, flew me to Paris for a weekend, and made me believe I was the center of his universe. I, a girl from a quiet suburban town in Ohio, was swept away by the whirlwind. I mistook his possessiveness for passion, his control for care. The first cracks appeared slowly. It started with small comments about my friends, then suggestions about my career, which he felt was unbefitting of a Vance. Soon I had no friends left that he hadn't implicitly scared off, and my career was a distant memory. My life became a carefully managed schedule of lunches with other society wives, charity board meetings, and ensuring the household ran with silent, sterile perfection. Then came Sabrina Croft. She was everything I wasn't. She was hard-edged, polished by old money, and she moved through our social circles with the predatory grace of a panther. She was the vice president of acquisitions at a rival firm, and their professional competition quickly bled into the personal. At first, it was whispers at cocktail parties. Then a friend showed me a picture from a gossip column, Richard and Sabrina laughing intimately on a yacht in St. Bart's. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He gaslighted me with chilling precision. "Cassandra, it's business. You're being hysterical. Do you have any idea the pressure I'm under? I need an escape, not a shrew waiting for me at home." The discovery of my pregnancy should have been a joyous occasion. For a fleeting moment, I thought it might save us. When I told Richard, his face was unreadable. There was no joy, no excitement, just a quiet, calculating stillness. A week later, he told me he had concerns. Concerns about what Richard... I had asked my hand protectively on my barely there bump. "Your fidelity, Cassandra," he said, the words dropping like ice chips into the tense air. "Things haven't been right between us for a long time. I need to be sure." The accusation was so ludicrous, so profoundly insulting, that I couldn't even form a response. I hadn't been with another man since I met Richard. My world had shrunk to a perimeter defined entirely by him. The idea was absurd, a weapon designed to wound me in the most intimate way possible. But I saw the steel in his eyes, and I knew he meant it. This wasn't about his genuine doubt. It was about power. It was about publicly branding me as a potential adulteress, giving him the moral high ground to leave me for Sabrina while retaining his family's pristine reputation. My refusal to cooperate led to the summons. He was taking me to court, turning the most personal aspect of our lives into a public spectacle. He hired a bulldog of a lawyer, a man named Leonard Davies, known for shredding reputations on the witness stand. I, in turn, found Helen Reed, a woman whose calm demeanor masked a brilliant and ferocious legal mind. "He wants to humiliate you, Cassie," Helen told me during our first meeting in her sleek, minimalist office. "He wants to paint you as a cheating gold digger so he can divorce you without touching the Vance family trust. Our job is to not let that happen." The days leading up to the first court hearing were a blur of anxiety. I barely ate, sleep was a stranger, and a constant low-grade cramping in my abdomen became my unwelcome companion. Richard and I lived as ghosts in the opulent apartment, communicating only through terse notes left with the housekeeper. He spent his nights out, returning in the early hours, smelling of Sabrina's expensive perfume, a scent I had come to recognize and despise. The evening before the hearing, I found an earring by our bedside table. It was a single diamond stud, elegant and expensive. It wasn't mine. I held it in my palm, the cold facets digging into my skin. It was a message. A declaration that I was being replaced, that my space, my home, my life was no longer my own. I didn't cry. The sadness had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of rage. I placed the earring in my purse. It was evidence not of my infidelity, but of his cruelty. As I dressed for court the next morning, I looked at my reflection. The dark circles under my eyes told a story of sleepless nights. My body, once my own, now felt like a battleground. I chose a simple navy blue maternity dress, something conservative and unimpeachable. As I smoothed it down over my belly, I felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang. I dismissed it as nerves. It was a mistake that would soon play out on the grandest, most humiliating stage imaginable. Little did I know the real drama had nothing to do with Richard's fabricated suspicions. A much older, darker secret was lurking in the shadows of the Vance family tree, waiting for the harsh light of the courtroom to expose it. The New York County Courthouse was a mausoleum of secrets, its marble halls echoing with the ghosts of past litigations. The air was thick with the scent of old paper floor polish and desperation. As Helen and I walked towards Family Court, Part 4, every footstep felt like a drumbeat marching me toward my own execution. The weight of the Vance name was palpable. I could feel the stares of court officers and clerks, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Richard and Sabrina were already there, seated at the plaintiff's table. They looked like a power couple posing for a magazine cover. Richard was in a custom-tailored charcoal suit, his expression a carefully crafted mask of aggrieved solemnity. Sabrina sat beside him, not behind him as a mere spectator, but right at the table, a brazen statement of her position. She wore a blood-red dress that stood in stark contrast to my somber navy blue. Her hand rested on Richard's arm, her posture radiating an unshakable, smug confidence. She was a victor surveying her conquered territory. Across the aisle from them, Leonard Davies Richards' lawyer was arranging a stack of files with theatrical precision. He was a man in his late 60s with a face like a clenched fist and small, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He was known for his scorched earth tactics, and I was his target for the day. Helen gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. "Deep breaths, Cassie. Don't look at them. Look at me or the judge. They want a reaction. Don't give them one." The courtroom began to fill. I recognized a few faces from the society page's vultures who had scented blood in the water. The Vance family name guaranteed a spectacle. Judge Alistair Miller entered a stern-faced man whose reputation for no-nonsense justice preceded him. The room stood. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Be seated." Judge Miller commanded, his voice a low, gravelly tone that demanded respect. He put on his glasses and peered down at the paperwork before him. "We are here today regarding the petition of Mr. Richard Vance for a court-ordered paternity test in the matter of his marriage to Mrs. Cassandra Vance. Mr. Davies, you may begin." Davies rose slowly, buttoning his jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor. The matter before us today is a deeply painful one for my client." He gestured towards Richard, who dutifully lowered his head as if in sorrow. "Mr. Vance, a respected pillar of our community, a man of unimpeachable character, has been forced to confront a devastating possibility that the child his wife carries may not be his." Helen was on her feet instantly. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is characterizing and testifying. There is no evidence of anything other than Mr. Vance's unsubstantiated and insulting suspicions." "Sustained," Judge Miller said with a bored sigh. "Get to the point, Mr. Davies." Davies gave a thin smile. "Of course, Your Honor. For several months, the marital relationship between my client and the respondent has been strained. There has been a noticeable change in Mrs. Vance's behavior. A secretiveness, unexplained absences, a general cooling of affection towards my client. It was a complete fabrication. My unexplained absences were walks in the park to escape the oppressive atmosphere of our apartment. My secretiveness was the silence of a woman who knew her husband was having a very public affair. I felt a hot flush of anger creep up my neck. These changes coincided with the period of conception." Davies continued, his voice dripping with insinuation. "My client, wanting to believe the best of his wife, tried to ignore the signs. But as a man preparing to welcome a child into the world, he has a right, nay, a duty to know if he is in fact the father. This is not about malice, Your Honor. This is about truth." He sat down, and the silence in the room was deafening. Every eye was on me. I felt stripped bare, my reputation being methodically dismantled with polite, poisonous lies. Sabrina was watching me, a small, cruel smirk playing on her lips. Helen rose. Her voice was calm and clear, a stark contrast to Davies' theatricality. "Your Honor, what Mr. Davies calls truth, I call cruelty. What he calls a painful matter for his client is in fact a calculated legal strategy. Mr. Vance is publicly engaged in an extramarital affair with the woman sitting beside him, Ms. Sabrina Croft." She gestured towards Sabrina, whose smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. "Objection," Davies barked. "My client's personal life is not on trial here. It is when he is using this petition as a weapon to slander his pregnant wife's character in preparation for a divorce, Your Honor," Helen shot back. "Mrs. Vance has been a faithful, loyal wife. The only infidelity in this marriage is the one being flaunted at the plaintiff's table. This petition is a baseless, humiliating tactic designed to emotionally distress a pregnant woman and prejudice any future divorce proceedings. We assert that Mrs. Vance is willing to take a paternity test, not because she gives any credence to this outrageous accusation, but to put an end to this circus and prove once and for all the baselessness of her husband's claim. Judge Miller listened intently, his fingers steepled under his chin. He looked from Richard to me, his gaze lingering for a moment. I met his eyes, hoping he could see the truth past the legal maneuvering. Throughout the proceedings, I felt that familiar cramping sensation return more insistent this time. I tried to shift in my seat, breathing slowly, as Helen had taught me, attempting to will the discomfort away. I attributed it to the immense stress, the public humiliation of it all. The baby inside me felt like the only ally I had in the room, and the thought of the stress affecting my child filled me with a fresh wave of panic. "Very well," Judge Miller finally said. "Given the respondent's willingness to comply, the court orders that a paternity test be conducted. A court-appointed phlebotomist will take samples from Mr. and Mrs. Vance today. The results will be delivered directly to this court. We will reconvene upon their receipt." He banged his gavel. "This hearing is adjourned." Relief washed over me so potent it made me dizzy. It was almost over. The test would prove my innocence. But as I pushed my chair back to stand, the cramping intensified into a sharp, searing pain that stole my breath. I gasped, my hand flying to my lower abdomen. Helen turned to me, her face etched with concern. "Cassie, are you all right?" I tried to answer to say it was just a cramp, but no words came out. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and the polished wood of the defendant's table felt cold beneath my suddenly clammy hands. The muted sounds of the courtroom, the shuffling of papers, the low murmurs faded into a dull roar in my ears. The world began to tilt on its axis. And then I felt a horrifying, unmistakable warmth spread beneath me. The pain was a white-hot spike driving through my lower back and abdomen. It was nothing like the dull aches of early pregnancy. This was sharp, violent, and terrifying. My vision swam the stern face of Judge Miller blurring into the wood paneling behind him. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. "Cassie." Helen's voice was sharp with alarm. She was by my side in an instant, her arm around my shoulders. "What is it? What's wrong?" I couldn't speak. I could only look down. On the polished oak of the courtroom chair, a dark stain was beginning to bloom. My navy blue dress, chosen to convey sobriety and strength, was now the canvas for my deepest fear. The stain was spreading a visible mark of some terrible internal failure. It was blood. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The hushed murmurs erupted into a flurry of frantic whispers. I saw the flash of a phone camera from the back row before a bailiff quickly shut it down. My private terror was now public sport. Richard hadn't moved. He stood frozen at his table, his face a canvas of shock that quickly morphed into something else, a cold, disgusted revulsion. It was the look a man gives when he steps in something foul. There was no concern, no flicker of worry for me or our child. There was only judgment. But it was Sabrina's reaction that would be seared into my memory forever. As my knees buckled and Helen struggled to hold me up, a single sharp sound cut through the chaos. Clap. It was crisp, shocking, and utterly deliberate. I turned my head, my vision tunneling, and saw Sabrina Croft. She was on her feet, a slow, malicious smile spreading across her face. She brought her hands together again. Clap. She was applauding. Her eyes, glittering with triumph, were locked on mine. In her twisted view, this was the ultimate proof. The scarlet letter I deserved, displayed for all to see. A woman bleeding in a courtroom during a paternity hearing could only mean one thing to her, a guilty conscience manifesting as a guilty body. It was divine retribution, a miscarriage of justice in her favor. This was her moment of vindication, and she was savoring it with a theatrical cruelty that stunned the entire room into a momentary horrified silence. "Oh my God!" someone in the gallery whispered. The judge's face was a thundercloud. "Bailiff, remove that woman now!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Sabrina. "And somebody call 911! Two burly bailiffs converged on Sabrina, who simply shrugged her smile, never wavering, and allowed them to escort her out. Her work was done. The image was created, the narrative set. Leonard Davies rushed to Richard's side, whispering urgently in his ear, likely advising him on the optics of the situation. Richard finally moved, but not toward me. He took a half step, then stopped, looking utterly lost, his revulsion warring with the public expectation of a husband's duty. He looked like he couldn't bear to touch me. Pain, sharp and relentless, was pulling me under. "The baby," I whimpered, my hand pressed desperately against my stomach. "Helen, the baby. They're coming, Cassie. Just hold on. Breathe with me," she urged, her own voice strained with panic as she helped lower me to the floor, trying to preserve some shred of my dignity. Paramedics burst through the courtroom doors, their gear clattering on the marble floors. They were a whirlwind of calm, professional urgency. Questions were fired at me that I couldn't answer. How far along? Any complications? When did the bleeding start? Helen answered for me, her voice a steady anchor in my swirling vortex of pain and fear. As they loaded me onto the gurney, my eyes found Richard's. He was standing near the courtroom door, held back by his lawyer. There was no anguish in his eyes. There was only a chilling, calculating distance. He was already spinning this, I knew. He was already crafting the story of his unfaithful, hysterical wife whose body betrayed her lies. He saw my potential miscarriage not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. It was the final convenient erasure of a problem. The last thing I saw before they wheeled me out of the courtroom was the dark stain on the chair, a stark, accusing Rorschach test under the harsh fluorescent lights. To the world, thanks to Sabrina's applause, it was an admission of guilt. To me, it was the physical manifestation of the stress and heartbreak that had been poisoning me for months. As the doors swung shut, sealing off the chamber of my humiliation, I closed my eyes and prayed. Not for my marriage, which was already dead, but for the tiny, innocent life that was now paying the price for the sins of its family. The hospital was an antiseptic world of white walls and hushed efficiency, a stark contrast to the chaotic drama of the courtroom. They rushed me to the maternity wing, the gurney wheels squeaking a frantic rhythm on the linoleum floors. In the examination room, time seemed to stretch and warp. Nurses and doctors moved around me, their faces calm, but their actions swift. I was a collection of symptoms, a medical puzzle to be solved. They drew blood-attached monitors and performed an ultrasound, the cold gel on my stomach, a shocking reminder of the life hanging in the balance. The minutes I waited for the doctor to return with the ultrasound results were the longest of my life. I stared at the acoustic tile ceiling, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, bracing for the worst. The memory of Sabrina's clapping hands echoed in my mind, a cruel soundtrack to my terror. Finally, a kind-faced obstetrician, Dr. Anya Sharma, came in. She pulled up a stool, and her expression was cautiously optimistic. "Mrs. Vance," she began gently, "the good news is that the baby is still viable. We have a strong heartbeat." A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped me. It was a raw, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very core of my being. The baby was alive. "The bleeding," Dr. Sharma continued, "is from a subchorionic hematoma. It's essentially a bleed between the membranes of the placenta and the uterus. It's often caused by extreme stress. While it increases the risk of complications, it's not necessarily a sign of an impending miscarriage. We need to keep you here for observation, and you will need to be on strict bed rest for the foreseeable future. The next few weeks will be critical. Stress. The word hung in the air. The doctor didn't know the half of it. My body hadn't betrayed me. It had simply buckled under the weight of Richard's cruelty. The first visitor I had was my best friend, Olivia. She burst into the room, her face pale with worry, having rushed over from her office downtown after seeing a news alert on her phone. "Oh, Cassie," she breathed, enveloping me in a hug that was both fierce and gentle. "I came as soon as I heard. Are you okay, the baby?" I filled her in, my voice cracking as I recounted the entire sordid affair from Davy's accusations to Sabrina's monstrous applause. Olivia listened, her expression hardening from concern to pure fury. "That woman is a ghoul," she seethed. "And Richard, to just stand there to let this happen, he's not a man, Cassie. He's a monster wrapped in a $1,000 suit." She held my hand tightly. "You can't go back to him. You know that, right? This is the end." I knew she was right. Any lingering foolish hope I had for our marriage had bled out onto the courtroom floor. "I know," I whispered. "I'm just so scared, Liv, for the baby." "We'll get through this," she said with a conviction I didn't feel myself. "You and me and this little one. We're a team." My next visitor was Richard. He arrived a few hours later looking uncomfortable and out of place in the sterile hospital room. He brought no flowers, just an air of cold formality. He stood by the door, his hands in his pockets, refusing to get any closer. "I spoke with Davies," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He says this incident complicates things, but the court order for the sample still stands. They'll send a phlebotomist here tomorrow." I stared at him incredulous. I was lying in a hospital bed, our child's life at risk, and his first concern was the logistics of the paternity test. "Is that all you have to say to me, Richard?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of weakness and rage. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were like chips of ice. "What do you want me to say, Cassandra? That I'm not thinking what everyone else in that courtroom was thinking? That the timing is just a little too perfect, a dramatic medical event in the middle of a hearing to determine your fidelity?" The cruelty of his insinuation was breathtaking. He actually believed it, or more accurately, he was choosing to believe it because it fit his narrative. "Get out," I said, my voice dangerously low. "Cassie, I said get out!" I screamed, the effort sending a fresh pang of pain through my abdomen. "Get out of my room! Don't you dare come back here!" He flinched, then his face hardened. With a curt nod, he turned and walked out, leaving the scent of his expensive cologne and his cold ambition lingering in the air. The most unexpected visitor arrived that evening. It was Arthur Vance Richards' father. He was the patriarch of the Vance clan, a formidable man in his late 60s, who exuded an aura of quiet, immense power. He had always been formally polite to me, but distant, as if I were a curiosity his son had brought home. He entered the room carrying a large bouquet of white lilies, their funereal scent filling the small space. "Cassandra," he said, his voice a low baritone. "I was so sorry to hear what happened. How are you feeling?" "I'm stable, Arthur. The baby is... They're monitoring us," I stammered, intimidated as always by his presence. He set the flowers on the bedside table and pulled the visitor's chair closer, a move that surprised me with its intimacy. He looked at me, his gaze intense. "Richard is a fool," he said, the statement so blunt and unexpected it took my breath away. "He is letting that Croft woman lead him by the nose. He's so obsessed with winning, he can't see what he's destroying." I didn't know how to respond. This was the most personal conversation I had ever had with my father-in-law. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "Listen to me, Cassandra. Whatever is happening between you and my son, you must protect that child. That child is a Vance. It carries our blood, our legacy. It is more important than Richard's foolish pride, more important than anything. Do you understand?" There was a strange, almost desperate urgency in his eyes that unsettled me. It seemed to go beyond a grandfather's typical concern. It felt proprietary, possessive. "Of course I'll protect my baby," I said, my hand instinctively going to my stomach. "Good," he said, patting my hand awkwardly. The touch was cool and dry. "The Vance family will provide for you and the child regardless of my son's actions. You have my word." He stood up, his formal demeanor snapping back into place. "Rest now. You need your strength." With that, he was gone. I lay back against the pillows, confused by the encounter. His words, meant to be reassuring, had left me with a profound sense of unease. "That child is a Vance. It carries our blood." Why had he emphasized it so fiercely? It felt less like a statement of fact, and more like a command, or even a threat. In the sterile quiet of the hospital room, a tiny dark seed of doubt was planted not about my fidelity, but about the very nature of the family I had married into. The days that followed were a quiet purgatory. Confined to the hospital bed, I had nothing to do but watch the city lights flicker outside my window and feel the gentle, reassuring flutters of my baby, a small miracle of defiance in the face of so much turmoil. The court-appointed phlebotomist came and went, a sterile and silent woman who took my blood without a word. Richard, I was informed by Helen, had given his sample at a private lab. The countdown had begun. Helen was my rock. She visited daily, bringing legal updates, fresh fruit, and a fierce, unwavering belief in me. She handled the press, who were circling like sharks, and began preparing the groundwork for the divorce proceedings that were now inevitable. The results should be delivered to Judge Miller's chambers by Friday, she told me on a Thursday afternoon. He wants to see us, just the lawyers and the parties involved in his chambers. No gallery, no press. He wants to put an end to the circus. The news sent a jolt of anxiety through me, but it was different this time. The fear was still there, but it was tempered by a steely resolve. Richard and Sabrina had put me through a public crucible. They had gambled on my humiliation, and now the cards were about to be turned over. I was ready for it to be over. I was ready for my name to be cleared. On Friday morning, I was discharged from the hospital with strict orders for bed rest. Helen picked me up and drove me not to the penthouse I once called home, but to a short-term luxury apartment she had arranged, a safe haven where Richard couldn't reach me. We went straight from there to the courthouse. The judge's chambers were a stark contrast to the public courtroom. They were lined with dark wood and leather-bound books, a quiet, serious space. Judge Miller sat behind a large mahogany desk, his expression unreadable. Richard was already there with Leonard Davies at his side. He refused to look at me, his jaw set in a tight, stubborn line. Sabrina was not present, a small mercy for which I was grateful. "Please be seated," the judge said, gesturing to the chairs opposite his desk. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. A court clerk handed Judge Miller a sealed 9x12 manila envelope. My entire future was inside that envelope. Judge Miller slid it open with a letter opener, the soft rasp of paper sounding like a cannon blast in the silent room. He withdrew a single-page report and placed it on the desk before him, taking a long moment to read it to himself. I held my breath, my hands gripping the arms of my chair. I could see Richard out of the corner of my eye, a smug, expectant look on his face. He truly believed this was his moment of vindication. "Well, Judge Miller finally said, looking up from the paper. He looked directly at Richard. "The results of the DNA analysis are conclusive." He slid the paper across the desk. Leonard Davies picked it up first, his eyes quickly scanning the page. I watched as a flicker of confusion crossed his face, quickly suppressed. He passed it to Richard. Richard read the first line, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his lips. He looked straight at me, his eyes filled with a venomous, "I told you so." "Read the rest of it, Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice flat. Richard's eyes returned to the page. I watched his face as he processed the information. His triumphant smile faltered, then vanished completely. The color drained from his face, replaced by a ghastly, sallow pallor. His mouth fell slightly open. He looked from the paper to me, then back to the paper, his mind clearly unable to reconcile what he was seeing. There must be a mistake," he stammered, his voice a choked whisper. Helen, sensing the shift, stood and walked to the desk, leaning over to read the document. Her eyes widened, and she took a sharp, audible breath. She turned to look at me, her expression one of utter, profound shock. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Helen, what does it say?" Richard threw the paper down on the desk as if it had burned him. Davies snatched it up, rereading it as if to decipher a foreign language. Helen walked back to me, her composure regained, and knelt beside my chair. She took my hand. "Cassie," she said, her voice low and steady. "The first part of the report is the standard paternity analysis." She paused, taking a deep breath. "It says that based on the DNA markers analyzed, the probability of Richard Vance being the biological father is 0%. The words hit me like a physical blow. 0. It wasn't possible. It was a lie. A mistake. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. A lab error. A sample switch. My entire case, my entire claim to fidelity, had just been vaporized. A harsh, disbelieving laugh erupted from Richard. "0," he said the word, dripping with scorn. He finally looked at me, his eyes blazing with fury and a twisted sort of glee. 0%. After all your righteous indignation, after all your lies, who was it, Cassandra? Who was the man you cheated on me with? I couldn't answer. My world had tilted off its axis. My innocence, the one truth I had clung to, had been scientifically disproven. I looked at Helen, my eyes pleading for an explanation. "There's more, Richard," Helen said, her voice cutting through his tirade like a knife. "There's a second part to the report, an addendum from the lab." "What addendum?" Davies snapped. "This is conclusive. Because of the high-profile nature of the case and the wealth of the Vance family." Helen explained, her gaze fixed on Richard. "The lab's protocol is to run a secondary analysis in the case of a paternal exclusion. They run the child's DNA against a wider familial index to check for anomalies or potential sample contamination. In this case, they found a match, not a contamination." She stood up and took the report from Davies' nerveless fingers. She held it up, her voice ringing with cold, clear finality. "The test excludes Richard Vance as the father," she announced to the stunned room. "But it identifies a paternal match with a 99% probability to a close male relative, specifically the father of Richard Vance." Silence. A profound, absolute silence descended upon the judge's chambers. It was heavier than stone, a crushing weight of disbelief and horror. The only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart, a panicked drumbeat against the wall of my chest. Arthur Vance. The name echoed in the cavern of my mind. It was a phantom, an impossibility, a grotesque distortion of reality. Arthur. The calm, powerful patriarch, The man who had visited me in the hospital, his words about Vance blood and legacy now taking on a hideous, monstrous new meaning. Richard was the first to break. He made a strange, strangled sound, a mix between a gasp and a sob. He staggered back a step, his hand coming up to clutch his chest as if he'd been shot. "No," he whispered. "No. It's a lie. It's a mistake." He turned on me, his face a mask of contorted rage and confusion. "What did you do? What kind of sick game is this? Did you and my father—" The accusation died on his lips. The sheer insanity of it too much for even him to fully articulate. But my mind was already racing backward, scrambling through a fog of memory to a specific night nearly 4 months ago, the Vance family's annual foundation gala. I had been feeling unwell, a touch of the flu, and had wanted to stay home, but Richard insisted I make an appearance. I remember having a single glass of champagne, which had tasted slightly off. The rest of the evening was a blur. I'd felt dizzy, disoriented. Arthur had guided me to a quiet room to lie down, saying he would have a driver take me home shortly. Richard was busy networking, he'd said. I remembered waking up in my own bed the next morning with a pounding headache and a hazy, incomplete memory of the night. Richard had been cold and dismissive, annoyed that I'd made a scene by leaving early. I had chalked it up to the flu, to the stress. But now that blank space in my memory felt like a gaping black wound. The implications crashed over me in a sickening wave. I hadn't been sick. I had been drugged. I had been assaulted. And the man who did it was not some stranger, but the grandfather of the child I was carrying. I started to tremble uncontrollably, a deep, bone-rattling chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. The baby inside me, my precious, innocent child, was the product of a horrific violation. Judge Miller, who had remained silent through the initial shock, finally spoke. His face was pale, his voice strained. "Mr. Vance," he said, his words directed at a stunned Leonard Davies, but his eyes fixed on Richard. "Given this unprecedented development, I believe we have moved far beyond the scope of a simple paternity hearing." He looked at me, his expression softening with a flicker of horrified pity. "Mrs. Vance, are you all right?" I couldn't answer. I was drowning. Helen was by my side again, her arm a firm, grounding presence around my shoulders. "My client has just been subjected to information of the most traumatic nature, Your Honor. I request a recess." "Of course," the judge said, already reaching for his phone. "Mr. Davies, you and your client will remain here. I am going to have the district attorney's office send someone over immediately." The mention of the district attorney seemed to snap Richard out of his stupor. The reality of the situation, the public scandal, the destruction of his family's name, the utter betrayal hit him with the force of a physical blow. "My father," he said, his voice cracking. He looked at Davies, his eyes wide with a child's terror. He wouldn't. He couldn't. But he could. And he did. Arthur Vance, the man who preached about legacy and family honor, was a predator hiding in plain sight. His obsession with the baby, his strange visit to the hospital, it all clicked into place. He wasn't protecting a grandchild. He was protecting his own biological issue, his secret heir born of a monstrous crime. The DNA report wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a confession. It was the scientific proof of a sin so dark it threatened to swallow the entire Vance dynasty whole. The father Richard had spent his life trying to please the man whose approval he craved had betrayed him in the most fundamental way possible. He hadn't just stolen his wife. He had stolen his future, his legacy, and his identity. The child Richard had tried to disown was in fact his own half-brother. I finally found my voice a ragged whisper filled with nausea. That night, the gala, Richard's head snapped toward me. He saw the dawning horror and understanding in my eyes, and for the first time the fury in his expression was not directed at me. It was directed at a truth so ugly it was unbearable. The secure, orderly world of Richard Vance, built on wealth, power, and prestige, had been built on a lie. And I, the woman he had tried to publicly destroy, was the unwilling vessel of its revelation. The humiliation he had planned for me had boomeranged back with catastrophic force, aimed not just at him, but at the very foundation of his world, his father. The drama wasn't about a cheating wife anymore. It was about the sins of a patriarch, a rot at the core of a powerful family exposed for all to see by a simple, undeniable double helix. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. The judge's chambers became the epicenter of a legal and media earthquake that sent shockwaves through New York's elite. News of the DNA results and the implied crime leaked almost instantly, a testament to the porous walls of the justice system when a name like Vance is involved. The story was a Molotov cocktail of sex power betrayal and crime, a story too lurid for even the most jaded tabloids to ignore. Arthur Vance was arrested within hours. He didn't put up a fight. When the police arrived at the Vance Holdings Tower, he was reportedly sitting in his office, staring out at the city he had once commanded a man already defeated. The legal case against him would be built on the DNA evidence, and my fragmented traumatic memories, which I recounted to compassionate but firm detectives from the Special Victims Unit. For Richard, the revelation was a public and private apocalypse. His entire identity was shattered. The father he revered was a monster. The wife he'd accused was a victim of that monster. The child he'd rejected was his own brother. He became a recluse, disappearing from public life. The business world, which worships strength and abhors scandal, turned its back on him. Vance Holdings' stock plummeted. Richard, the aggressive corporate titan, was reduced to a tragic figure in a Greek drama of his father's making. He filed for divorce quietly, his petition no longer filled with accusations, but with a single damning line, irreconcilable differences. He didn't fight me on a single term of the settlement. It was the largest in the state's history, but it felt less like a victory and more like blood money. And Sabrina Croft. She vanished. In a world where reputation is currency, she was suddenly bankrupt. The woman who had clapped at my pain became a social pariah overnight. Associated with the Vances tainted by the scandal, her name became a punchline in the circles she had fought so hard to conquer. Her victory had been a mirage, and the reality that replaced it was a brutal career-ending exile. I never saw or heard from her again. My journey was quieter, but no less profound. Helen helped me navigate the legal labyrinth, shielding me from the worst of the media frenzy. I used the settlement money not to live a life of idle luxury, but to build a fortress of safety and privacy for myself and my unborn child. I left New York, the city of my dreams, that had become the stage for my nightmare. I bought a quiet, beautiful home in a coastal California town where no one knew the name Vance. I spent the final months of my pregnancy healing. There were therapy sessions to process the trauma of the assault, prenatal yoga classes, to reconnect with the body that I felt had been colonized, and long, quiet walks on the beach where I could feel the sea air washing away the filth of my past. There were dark days, days when I looked at my growing belly and felt a surge of fear and revulsion seeing Arthur's face instead of an innocent child's. But then the baby would kick a strong, insistent thump that reminded me he was his own person. He was not his biological father. He was not his uncle. He was my son. My love for him was fierce and protective, a mother's love forged in the fires of adversity. I gave birth to a healthy baby boy in late spring. I named him Benjamin. Not Arthur, not Richard. A name that was all his own. Holding him for the first time, seeing his tiny, perfect face, I knew that all the pain, all the humiliation had been worth it to get to this moment. He was the end of the Vance's toxic legacy and the beginning of my new one. My life is not a fairy tale. The scars are still there, pale lines on the landscape of my soul, but they are a reminder of the battle I survived. I am no longer Cassandra Vance, the society wife trapped in a gilded cage. I am Cassandra Reed, my own woman, a mother, a survivor. Sometimes when the house is quiet and Benjamin is sleeping in his crib, I think back to that courtroom. I remember the pain, the blood, the crushing humiliation, and I remember the sound of that clap. For Sabrina, it was a sound of victory. For Richard, it was the sound of my conviction. But for me, in the end, it was the sound of my chains breaking. It was the sound that set in motion the terrible, painful, and ultimately liberating truth. It was the sound that gave me my freedom and gave me my son. It was the sound of the end which allowed for a new beginning to rise from the ashes. 5 years passed. The roar of the New York scandal faded to a distant echo, a story other people told. My life was now measured in seasons marked by the blooming of the bougainvillea that climbed the walls of my California home and the inches my son grew each year. The Pacific Ocean was a constant, soothing presence, its rhythmic waves a lullaby that had washed away the last traces of courtroom marble and hospital antiseptic. Benjamin was a whirlwind of joyous energy, all scraped knees and endless questions. He had my eyes, but a spirit that was entirely his own, bright, inquisitive, and unburdened. He knew nothing of the Vances, nothing of the darkness from which he was conceived. To him, our world was simple. It was the two of us, our sunny garden, our dog Gus, and the stories I read to him every night. One warm afternoon, while Ben was napping, I was scrolling through the news on my tablet, catching up on a world that felt a million miles away. A familiar name in a headline caught my eye. It was from a business journal, a retrospective piece titled, "An Empire in Ruins, The Vance Legacy 5 Years On." A cold knot of curiosity, an emotion I hadn't felt in years, compelled me to click. The article was a clinical autopsy of a fallen dynasty. Arthur Vance had died in prison 3 years prior, succumbing to a swift and aggressive cancer. He died alone, stripped of his power and prestige, his name forever synonymous with shame. Vance Holdings, unable to recover from the scandal and the subsequent leadership vacuum, had been carved up and sold for parts. The iconic Vance Tower on Park Avenue now bore the name of a Japanese tech conglomerate. The legacy Arthur had murdered to protect had crumbled to dust. The final paragraph was about Richard. After the divorce, he had liquidated his assets and vanished from New York society. A reporter had tracked him down to a small, isolated town in rural New Hampshire. He lived a quiet, solitary life, never speaking of his family. The article included a recent grainy photograph of a man who looked decades older than his years, graying and stooped, buying groceries at a small market. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a ghost. I closed the tablet expecting to feel something triumph, perhaps, or a bitter satisfaction. But I felt nothing. It was like reading about the history of a distant, fallen civilization. Their fates had no bearing on my life, on the sun warming my skin, on the sound of my son stirring from his nap in the next room. "Mommy," Ben's small voice called. I went into his room and he blinked up at me, his hair tousled from sleep. "I had a dream we were flying," he said with a sleepy grin. I smiled, my heart swelling with a love so pure it was an anchor. I pulled him into my arms, his small body warm against mine. As I held him, I realized the truth. Arthur's legacy wasn't in his name or his fortune. It was this small boy in my arms. But I was the one who would shape it. Benjamin's inheritance wouldn't be one of tainted blood and corporate greed. It would be one of love, resilience, and the knowledge that you can plant a new garden even on scorched earth. The Vance name was a ruin, but here in my arms was my life's great work, my beautiful, thriving legacy. Cassandra's story is a harrowing reminder that the most pristine surfaces can hide the deepest rot, and that the truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way to the light. Her journey through public humiliation and unimaginable betrayal ended not in defeat, but in the fierce, quiet strength of a survivor who reclaimed her own narrative. She endured the fire and emerged not burned, but forged into someone stronger. If you were moved by her journey from a victim of circumstance to the master of her own fate, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to let us know you want more stories of resilience and justice. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's possible to rise from the ashes. And most importantly, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a single story of truth triumphing over deceit. Thank you for listening.